Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmstead. As you can see, today's topic is age of mass politics. Now, as always, before we begin, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. You got it? Let's get started. Now, the main theme today is that the national state created a framework in European politics. Political parties dominated politics. Increased suffrage and literacy in Western and Central European countries in the late 19th century would result in higher expectations and demands among the people for the government to be responsive to their needs. So, this is the era, the age of mass politics. People are expecting the government to change. If you want to tie it to like US history, it's kind of like the Progressive period. As we're moving away from some of the, slum area, the Gilded Age, to let's make some changes using the government. So, let's begin. By this point, ordinary people felt increasing loyalty to their governments, nationalism. By 1914, universal male suffrage was generally the rule. Female suffrage would emerge after World War I. Politicians and parties in national parliaments represented the people more responsible as their increased suffrage. So in other words, governments had to respond more to the people because they would be voted out otherwise. The welfare state first emerges, first in Germany, then Britain, France, and other countries. In other words, the government will provide services and a social safety net to help poor people. And these governments were often led by conservatives who manipulated nationalism to create a sense of unity and divert attention from underlying class conflicts. Let's start here with Germany. Now, the government structure of Germany consisted of a federal union of Prussia and 24 smaller German states. Under Kaiser Wilhelm I, he had ultimate power in Germany. Otto von Bismarck would serve as chancellor and was the mastermind behind the government. Between 1871 and 1890, they would establish an integrated political and economic structure for Germany while dominating European diplomacy. They unified Germany's monetary system, established the imperial bank while strengthening existing banks, developed universal German civil and criminal codes, and established compulsory military service. Also, fun fact, they also created a really well-structured government-run public education system. In fact, it was the envy of the world, including those in the United States. Horace Mann took his honeymoon in Germany and marveled so well at the well-run school system, he returned to the United States in the 1870s and 80s to form the public school system as we know it today in the United States. But aside from that, Germany was a multi-party political system. And what emerged was known as Kulturkampf, or struggle for civilization. One party in general was the Central Party, or the Catholic Party. They approved of Bismarck's policy of centralization, yet promoted the political concept of peculiarism, which advocated regional priorities. But Germans and Catholics don't always play so nice because Germany is kind of the home to Protestantism. Most of the German states, especially in the north, were Protestant. And Bismarck sought to limit the influence of the Catholic Center Party in light of Pope Pius IX's declaration of papal infallibility. The Catholic Party was particularly strong, however, in southern German states. But they proved too popular among many Germans to be driven underground, and Bismarck ultimately failed to suppress the Catholic Center Party. The other major party was the Social Democratic Party, the SPD, who advocated for Marxist views. They were essentially socialist. They advocated for sweeping social legislation, sought universal suffrage, and genuine democracy. And likewise, Bismarck was unsuccessful in limiting its growth, though it was driven underground. So what do they actually get to do? Well, Bismarck would institute a set of sweeping reforms to minimize the threat from the left, the socialists. In 1879, a protective tariff was instituted to maintain domestic production. Modern social security laws were established, Germany being the first to do so. National sickness and accident insurance laws were passed in 1883 and 1884. Old age pension and retirement benefits were established in 1889, some 50 years before the U.S. does. Child labor was regulated, though not eliminated, and we would see improved working conditions. But despite the rising standard of living, workers did not leave the SPD. But by gaining support from the workers, Bismarck would be successful in somewhatly bypassing the middle class. But enter Wilhelm II. Wilhelm II would oppose Bismarck's renewed efforts to outlaw the SPD. To gain support of the workers, he forced Bismarck to resign. And by 1912, the SPD became the largest party in the Reichstag, the German government. Meanwhile, in France, we will have the Third French Republic. The Paris Commune of 1870-1871. In 1870, Napoleon III's Second Empire collapsed when it was defeated by Prussia in the Franco-Prussian War. A new assembly was created that would last from 1871 to 1875. However, the Paris Commune, this radical communist government, lay siege to Paris, and the Paris Commune refused to recognize the authority of the newly created National Assembly. From March until May of 1871, the Paris Commune fought a bloody struggle with the troops of the National Assembly. Thousands died in the Civil War, and 20,000 more were subsequently executed. Their defeat of the Paris Commune led to France's road to recovery, and the establishment of the Third French Republic in 1875. It was largely dominated by the bourgeois. France enjoyed periods of economic prosperity. A constitution was provided for the republic. The Chamber of Deputies held the most power, elected by universal suffrage. The president was weak, and the Senate was indirectly elected. They would produce a number of reforms, including trade unions fully legalized, that had been legalized and then unlegalized and re-legalized and unlegalized under Napoleon III. Established secular education and reform, expanded tax-supported public schools and compulsory education. During the Third Republic, the French government fell dozens of times. The multi-party system resulted in ever-shifting political coalitions. Challenges to the Republic came from the far right, those conservatives. The Panama Scandal of 1892, where Ferdinand de Lesseps failed in his attempt to build a canal in Panama while costing French taxpayers millions of dollars. The public perceived this as government as being corrupt, and thus reversing popular gains made at a previous period. Also, in 1894, the Dreyfus Affair is the most serious threat to the Republic. The military falsely charged Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jew, with supplying secrets to Germans. Monarchists, who supported the Catholic Church, used the incident to discredit the Republicans. Emile Zola, the realist author, took up the Dreyfus case and condemned the military. Leftists who supported the government in 1806, the case was closed when Dreyfus was declared innocent and returned to his military position. But the Dreyfus Affair led to an alliance between moderate Republicans and socialists. The conservatives in the military and church were thoroughly discredited for such a great offense against a military leader. The socialists would gain seats in the Chamber of Deputies from 1905 to 1914, and by 1914, the Third French Republic enjoyed vast support of the French people as they headed into World War I. In Britain, the period 1850 to 1865 saw the realignment of political parties there. Lord Palmerston, Henry John Temple, he was the Whig Prime Minister and dominant political figure in England between 1850 and 1865. The Tory party was transformed into the Conservative Party under Benjamin Disraeli. The Whig Party transformed into the Liberal Party under William Gladstone. Benjamin Disraeli was a conservative but expressed sympathy for the working class. He argued for aggressive foreign policy, expansion of the British Empire, and reluctantly supported democratic reforms, including the Reform Bill of 1867, which is described as his leap in the dark to appeal to the working class people. It redistributed the seats to provide more equitable representation in the House of Commons. Industrial cities and boroughs gained seats at the expense of some of the more depopulated areas of the North and West, the so-called rotten boroughs. Almost all men over age 21 in urban centers were granted the right to vote, essentially doubling the number of men who were eligible, but still fell short of universal male suffrage. In contrast, William Gladstone will emerge as the most important liberal figure in 19th century England. He supported Irish home rule, fiscal policy, free trade, extension of democratic principles while opposing imperialism. He abolished the compulsory taxes to support the Church of England. The Civil Service Reform Act was introduced in 1870 to create competitive examination for government positions. And the Reform Act of 1884 will grant suffrage to all adult males in the counties as the same basis as the boroughs, granting essentially universal suffrage. Again, not quite, close. Women's rights will also jump heavily in this period. Initially, women were seeking to amend marriage and property laws that discriminated against females. The existing laws allowed women to divorce if a wife committed adultery, but the woman could not secure a divorce if the male committed adultery, unless physical abuse, cruelty, or desertion had occurred. By the 1890s, women's rights activists realized that suffrage was the key to remedying those problems. They argued that men had not done enough to protect women from exploitation and abuse by men. And the suffragettes came largely from the middle class. Now, I broke this into kind of three groups here. There was the more conservative approach, led by Millicent Garrett Fawcett, who became the leader of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. She demanded that Parliament grant female suffrage. She helped to grow the suffrage movement and played a role in the national and international suffrage conferences. She was even knighted in 1924. However, there were much more militant suffragettes, including Emmeline Pankhurst, who's the radical. She was infuriated Parliament would not give women the right to vote, even though women in Finland had gained it back in 1906 and Norway in 1913. Along with her daughter, Pankhurst founded the Women's Social and Political Union, based on militant principles. Beginning in 1907, the WSPU undertook violent activities such as destroying railroad stations, works of art, and store windows, chaining themselves to the front of the gates of Parliament. They organized parades and demonstrations. Some men would even disapprove of this and attack the female marchers. A number of the female militants were arrested for their activities. Some went on hunger strikes in prison and were force-fed by authorities. This idea of more militant action in arresting and force-feeding is something that will be replicated in the United States. But perhaps the most notorious militant action occurred when Emily Davison committed suicide by throwing herself in front of the King's horse in the 1913 Epsom Derby. So picture this, the bottom right picture of your screen. They're at a racetrack watching horses race. And as the horses come around the bend, this woman throws herself in the middle of the track to be trampled by the horse to get all the men who are sitting there in luxury in the grandstand's attention. Did it work? Well, yeah. Not this instant by itself, but this movement works. In 1918, Britain passed the Representation of the People Act. And as a result of women's critical contributions during World War I and their radical feminist move for the suffrage movement, they will get the right to act for anyone over 30. And in 1928, that age limit will be reduced to 21 years of age. But then there's the issue of questions. So that's all the kind of moving forward age and mass politics. But while these three big nations are moving forward, Germany, France, and Britain, there become these new questions that begin to be thorns in the sides of these big three superpowers. And first, that begins with Irish. Young Ireland movement of 1848 echoed the nationalistic movements on the continent. The Irish question, however, was the most recurring and serious problem that Britain faced. Gladstone had pushed unsuccessfully for Irish home rule. Ulster a Protestant county in Northern Ireland, opposed Irish Home Rule because they enjoyed remarkable economic growth since the mid-1890s. The Ulsterites raised 100,000 armed volunteers to fight against this idea of Home Rule. In 1914, the Irish Home Rule Act passed by the Commons and Lords, but Protestants would not accept it. And the implementation would be deferred until after World War I. In 1916, independence movement known as the Easter Rebellion was crushed by British troops. By 1922, Ireland would finally gain independence, though Northern Ireland remained a part of the British Empire. Likewise, in Eastern Europe, the Ottoman Empire was termed the, quote, sick man of Europe, receding to the southeastern Europe in a constant state of crisis that existed in the Balkans. Who would control that region? Russia's dream was to retake the Balkans and ultimately Constantinople. There also was the pan-Slavic idea of uniting all Slavic peoples in Europe under one government, Russia. Russia's military victory over the Ottoman Empire in 1878 put it in position to dominate. But Britain refused to accept Russian control of the Balkans and sent the Royal Navy to help the Turks. This nationalistic spirit in Britain became known as Jingoism, after a very popular poem. The result in 1878 would be the Congress of Berlin, where Russia would gain very little from the conference despite defeating the Turks in war. The provisions of the conference were that Romania would be recognized along with Serbia and Montenegro as independent states. It established the autonomous Principality of Bulgaria. But Russian hostility toward Germany led Bismarck to embark upon a new system of alliances that would transform European democracy. The alliance system that led to World War I. Now, in addition to this, we will see the rise of Russia in a different way. The defeat in the Crimean War marked a turning point in Russian history by fostering modernization. Russia lacked a sizable middle class that promoted liberalism, economically, politically, or socially. The key difference for why Russia lagged behind Western and Central Europe was because they didn't have that middle class due to industrialization. The nobility did not constitute a force for modernization and reform because they were conservative by nature to protect their wealth. Russia realized it must modernize or remain vulnerable militarily. And Alexander II becomes the greatest leader of Russia since Catherine the Great. He was perhaps the most liberal ruler in Russia part of the 20th century. He believed that serfdom had held Russia's back from modernization, and that agriculture continued to be poor for centuries. In fact, 90% of Russian people worked in agriculture. Serfdom had led to numerous peasant uprisings, poor agricultural output, and exploitation of serfs by these oligarch lords. In 1861, the Emancipation Act, or Emancipation Edict, would abolish serfdom. Peasants were no longer dependent upon the lord. They were free to move and even change occupations. Most Russians lived in what were called mirs, or communes, that were highly regulated. These mirs developed collective ownership, and responsibility made it difficult for individual peasants to improve their methods or leave the villages because they were so tied to each other in this collectivist opportunity. Other reforms initiated by Alexander II include less censorship, again, not removed, but relaxed, and a more liberal education system. Now, the person in charge of the Russian industrialization after 1890 was Count S.Y. Witt. He aggressively courted Western capital and advanced technology to build great factories. The result would be the beginnings of a small Russian middle class. In 1900, he helped orchestrate the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway to modernize Russia and connect Moscow with Vladivostok, some 5,000 miles away. Russia put on the gold standard to strengthen its government's finances. And by 1900, Russia was now fourth in steel production behind the US, Germany, and Great Britain. And by 1900, Russia now exported half of the world's refined petroleum. But despite these economic and social reforms, Russia's economic problems were still staggering. 1/3 of Russian farmland was unused. food could not keep pace with the increasing population. The Depression of 1899 wiped out any gains, resulting in tremendous unemployment. And it would only be exacerbated in a coming war. In 1904, the Russians had established a sphere of influence in Manchuria and now sought to take over Korea for more resources. In response to this, the Japanese declared war on the Russians, leading to what's called the Russo-Japanese War, because Japan also wanted to make inroads onto the mainland cotton for resources. And to be clear, Japan was far more industrialized than Russia was. The humiliating defeat of Russia by Japan in a bloody war on land resulted in Russia turning away from East Asia and instead focusing on the Balkans. In other words, this so-called, lesser civilized Asian country had defeated the mighty European nation of Russia. Following this, in 1905, there would be what was known as the Revolution of 1905 in Russia. Poor economic and strains of war led peasants and middle class to demand many reforms. Bloody Sunday, January 1905, 200,000 workers and peasants marched peacefully to the Winter Palace asking for reforms. The Tsar was not in town. The army fired on the marchers in cold blood. As a result, the Duma was created, an assembly that would serve as an advisory body to the Tsar. It did grant freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of the press. However, the Tsar did still retain absolute veto. The revolutionaries were divided, resulting in the Duma having no real actual influence. Now, Russia would experience a mild economic recovery from 1907-1914, but their poor showing in World War I would directly lead to the Russian Revolution that is coming. So, while things were beginning to be somewhat more liberal in countries like Germany, France, and Great Britain, in these smaller, questionable areas like the Ireland, in Eastern Europe, and then in Russia, things were far from perfect. And especially in Eastern Russia, the question remains, how strong was that area? And as we're going to find out during World War I, the fact is they just weren't that strong at all, which will lead to even more liberal reforms in the post-war period. But that's for another day. So until then, take care, and bye-bye.